I paint winter, and I paint spring and summer, but there's my favorite. I just love to paint summer.
The most beloved painter in America has a secret. Norman Rockwell was concealing something that might have ended his career behind those joyful family photos. He depicted a scenario in 1964 that caused moms to conceal their children's eyes and older men to cry. The picture revealed the unpleasant reality of America that nobody wanted to see. The owners of the gallery declined to hang it. It wouldn't be printed in newspapers. Even though he knew it might destroy everything he had created, Rockwell painted it. The true Norman Rockwell may be seen in the artwork that nearly ended his career. On February 3, 1894, Norman Rockwell was born at 789 St. Nicholas Avenue in Harlem, New York City. Nancy Rockwell and Jarvis Rockwell were his parents. His father spent his entire life working for a textile company in Philadelphia. They survived despite not being wealthy. Despite living under the same roof, Norman and his older brother Jarvis were never particularly close. Things were a little complicated at home because his mother was Episcopalian and his father was Presbyterian. Norman's ancestry dates back to England, all the way to 1635, when John Rockwell arrived in America on the Hopewell and assisted in the colonization of Connecticut. Norman was unique even as a little youngster. In 1897, when he was just 3 years old, he would sit calmly and listen to his father read aloud from Charles Dickens. The stories weren't the only thing. It was the way Dickens used words to depict people. Norman saw his father, who enjoyed copying artwork from books. Something within of him awakened at that moment. The father of his mother was also an artist. He was forced to settle for painting landscapes because he never made much money. However, the spark had already dissipated. Stories, sketches, and silent struggles filled their tiny house. He was shaped by that. Norman already felt alienated by 1903, when he was 9 years old. He didn't fit in at school since he was awkward and thin. He also didn't feel very close to his parents. He was able to control his escape through drawing. Something that made sense. He drew for hours by himself, and eventually he started using comedy and exaggerated features as a coping mechanism for the way he was treated. His family relocated to Mamaroneck, a small village in Westchester County, from the city that same year. Everything altered as a result. Norman found new people, broad skies, and peaceful streets in Mamaroneck. The thought of living in a tiny town began to captivate him. He developed an obsession with the illustrations of Howard Pyle, a well-known figure at the time. In order to purchase art supplies, Norman started saving pennies. Even in times of financial hardship, Norman continued to draw despite his mother's rigorous religious upbringing. He documented everything he observed in his sketchbook, including faces, gestures, and fleeting moments. He will always remember that blend of small-town and metropolis life. When Norman was 14 years old in 1908, he made a significant choice. After graduating from high school, he enrolled at New York's Chase School of Fine and Applied Art. He traveled back and forth from Mamaroneck by rail every day. Despite their limited resources, his family did their best to provide for him. He took classes with live nude models while studying life drawing at Chase. For a boy brought up in such a rigid household, that was a shock, but he persisted. He was adamant. He moved to the National Academy of Design in 1910, and then shortly after, he joined the Art Students League of New York. He had instruction from Frank Demond, George Bridgman, and Thomas Fogarty there. He learned how to use graphics to communicate stories from Fogarty. He learned how to accurately sketch the human body from Bridgman. Norman gave up on being a fine artist at that point. He understood that illustration was his gift. His goal was to create stories that people could relate to. At the age of 18, Norman landed his first significant job in 1912. He was able to secure a commission from Fogarty to depict 12 of Carl Claudy's Tell Me Why stories. That work brought in $150 for him. The money wasn't the only factor. Everything changed in that instant. Edward Cave, who was creating Boy's Life magazine, was drawn to his art. Norman's eyes were full with hope as he entered the office. Cave provided him an opportunity. He requested him to create around 400 illustrations and settings for a camping guide. Norman remained slender at 6 feet and 140 pounds, so thin that the Navy would subsequently turn him away for being underweight during World War I. But that was irrelevant in 1912. He was on his way. Norman joined Boy's Life as its full-time art editor in 1913, a year later. He was just 19. It was unprecedented for someone so young to hold such a position. He put a lot of effort into producing hundreds of pictures that influenced how the public viewed the Boy Scouts. He gave them flawless clothes, genuine facial expressions, and wonderful trips. By 1929, the Boy Scout calendar was the best-selling calendar in the nation thanks to the popularity of his artwork. His early success made him cautious rather than conceited. He was aware of how easily things may go wrong. He thus put in much more effort. Norman and Clyde Forsyth, another artist, became good friends in 1914. Both of them rented an old barn that had formerly belonged to Frederick Remington, a well-known Western artist, and worked at Boy's Life. It felt like holy ground in that studio. Norman was encouraged by Forsyth to take further chances and submit his artwork to the Saturday Evening Post. They supported one another as they worked side by side. Norman gained confidence in addition to skill. He was no longer merely an illustrator for the Boy Scouts. He was growing into something greater. At the age of 20, Norman persuaded his family to relocate to New Rochelle in 1915. It was a wise choice. The best illustrators resided in New Rochelle. There were studios for artists like Norman's main influence, Joseph Leyendecker. Norman was further pushed by the creative atmosphere. In New York City, he maintained in touch with the publishing industry, met mentors, and established new friends. Although it was a financially hazardous move, it gave him access to opportunities he otherwise would not have had. Then 1916 arrived. Norman was 22. Everything changed that year. At last, he sent in a piece to the Saturday Evening Post. In May 1916, he made his first cover appearance. The sound resembled a thunderclap. He produced 6 covers for the Post between that first issue until January 1917. People paid attention. The Post was dubbed the best exhibition window in America in a full-page advertisement published by Life magazine. And at the center of it all was Norman's work. However, success was hard and quick. Norman was worn out by the time he reached 25. He quit his work at Boy's Life to devote himself fully to the Post. By then, he has previously created hundreds of pictures and 25 covers. A whirlwind occurred. Norman fought skepticism on the inside even if everything appeared to be ideal on the outside. He began to feel extremely anxious about his name, his appearance, and even his position in the world around 1911. He once remarked, "All I had was the ability to draw, which, in my opinion, wasn't very valuable." He depicted people who felt uncomfortable, uneasy, and ignored, but instead of giving up, he channeled those emotions into his work. He gave millions of Americans a sense of recognition in the process. Norman Rockwell married Irene O'Connor, a schoolteacher 3 years his senior, in the summer of 1916. In the same year, he had recently released his first Saturday Evening Post cover. He proposed at a New Rochelle boarding house where they hardly knew one another. But something didn't feel quite right from the beginning. Irene desired a typical household life. Norman was unable to take a break. His paintings were his obsession, and he frequently lost himself in them, forgetting everything else. They didn't have any kids. Years later, he made a painful confession in private. "I discovered she didn't love me after we had been married for a long." Nevertheless, the marriage continued for over 14 years. They decided to take separate vacations by 1929, shortly after the stock market disaster. Soon after, Irene filed for divorce in Reno. Norman was becoming a national celebrity despite the fact that his personal life was collapsing. He produced 25 Saturday Evening Post covers between 1916 and 1919, many of which included themes related to World War I. In one, a child asked whether a short man could serve in the military. He left his mark everywhere. He even appeared in full-page advertisements for memberships in Life magazine. However, Norman was only 22 years old at the time of all the success, and it was already too much. He started to feel anxious and thought he wouldn't be able to meet expectations. Norman's buddy Clyde Forsyth observed that he occasionally simply disappeared for a spell out of fear that people would forget about him. His artwork was evolving by 1920. It appeared less cartoonish and more sophisticated. Serious artists were praising him, and it was obvious that he had developed under the tutelage of George Bridgman. However, the pressure persisted. A nervous breakdown was the term used to describe Norman's collapse beneath the weight of everything. To heal, he had to move away. He had a close friendship with renowned illustrator J.C. He had an admiration for Leyendecker. The breakup marked a sea change. He was only in his middle 20s. Already bearing the burden of being America's most famous magazine illustrator. Norman began creating more than just magazine covers as the 1920s went on. He was requested for advertisements by big businesses. He created a Jell-O advertisement in 1923 that featured a contented family in a cheerful kitchen. Warmth like that would become his hallmark. Literary Digest, Country Gentleman, Leslie's Weekly, Judge, and Life were among the other periodicals he contributed to. These advertisements were profitable and allowed him to try new things. However, the pressure persisted even after that. He and Irene made the decision to go on different summer vacations in 1929 while they were both staying at Louisville Landing. Norman traveled to Europe to see museums in Austria, Spain, and France. Irene informed him that she had fallen in love with someone else when he returned. She wanted divorce. Norman took the news hard, despite his own tendency to flirt with women. The ultimate date of the divorce was January 13, 1930. He fled right away and lived with his friend Clyde Forsyth in Alhambra, California. He painted the doctor and the doll during that time. Forsyth introduced him to Mary Barstow, a 14-year-old math teacher and budding author, while he was there. Only a few months later, Norman married her. In the garden of her parents on April 17, 1930. Jarvis, Thomas, and Peter, the couple's 3 boys, were born shortly after. However, Norman's mental state was deteriorating once more. He was admitted to the hospital in 1933 due to what was referred to as nervous weariness. Every week, millions of people view his work, yet none is aware of the suffering he endures. In an attempt to rekindle his romance, he persuaded Mary to accompany him to Europe that same year. They brought their 5-month-old infant, Jarvis. He studied Rembrandt and other classics in Paris. But he fell into sadness rather than feeling motivated. He began accusing himself of being dishonest. He believed that the great artists in the museums were more important than his Saturday Night Post covers. His thoughts became so depressing that he contemplated suicide. I was deeply scarred by that trip. A new chance presented itself in 1935. He was invited to illustrate Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Ultimately initially objected to doing it, but ultimately agreed. Unlike most serious painters, he took a lot of reference images when studying Twain's hometown of Hannibal, Missouri. He was uncomfortable when he looked back at the illustrations, which were published in 1936 and 1940. Subtle racial stereotypes were present in some of the drawings. Norman said that he felt bad about the way he had represented some characters as the years went by and the civil rights movement grew stronger. Norman and Mary purchased a 60-acre farmhouse in Arlington, Vermont, by 1938. At first, it appeared to be the ideal way for them to provide their family with a tranquil life. They attended town meetings and square dances, but beneath the grins, things were unraveling. Mary had become more inebriated. In his journal, Norman described how she became aloof and irate after drinking. Even the little things, like swimming in the river on their property, were out of his reach. He said that the water was too cold, but in reality, he was constantly nervous. Norman began seeing Erik Erikson, a well-known psychiatrist who had fled Nazi Germany, in 1939. He was able to see that many of his joyful paintings served as a means of recovery from a lonely upbringing thanks to Erikson. Norman's mom had been aloof and uncaring. Growing up in New York, he never felt like he belonged anyplace. He wishes he had his paintings of loving, contented families. He was able to comprehend that through the therapy. It strengthened him to continue creating meaningful paintings. He drew inspiration for 4 paintings in 1942 from President Roosevelt's address on freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. The Saturday Evening Post wasn't thrilled when he pitched them to them. They were concerned that readers could be offended by the concept, but Norman was so convinced of it that he funded the project himself. He spent months painting, using his neighbors in Vermont as models. The 4 Freedoms toured 16 cities the following year, in 1943, and generated $132 million in war bonds, more than $2 billion in today's currency. The artworks were viewed by more than 1.2 million people. Norman came to sign prints, too. However, not everyone was content. The Freedom of Worship picture, which depicted individuals of various races and religions praying together, infuriated some Americans. Hate mail was sent to Rockwell accusing him of encouraging communist ideology and racial mixing. The posters were not displayed in some southern cities. Nevertheless, the tour was a huge success. There was a terrible incident that year. A fire destroyed Norman's whole studio in late 1943. He lost all of his personal belongings, which at the time were valued at over $100,000, along with hundreds of artworks, props, and costumes. More than $1.5 million today. His pipe ashes led some neighbors to claim it was an accident. Norman was among the others who thought it might have been arson. He had argued about property lines with a neighbor. Nothing was ever proven. The loss, his labor, his supplies, and his favorite pipes were what counted. As a token of love, the villagers handed him new pipes when he vanished one night. He painted Rosie the Riveter in 1943 as well. For the Saturday Evening Post's cover. Strong and self-assured, Rosie crushed Hitler's book beneath her feet. Mary Louise Doyle, a 19-year-old telephone operator, served as her model. Norman later felt bad for making Rosie appear considerably larger than her actual figure. However, many male readers were incensed even though the image became legendary. They terminated their magazine subscriptions, claiming it was abnormal. They objected to women working in male-dominated fields. However, Norman had already contributed to the development of a new type of American hero. In the midst of all this achievement, his marriage was failing. Mary's alcohol consumption worsened in the 1940s and 1950s. She needed to visit the Austin Riggs Center for mental health treatment. From their home in Vermont, it was a 90-minute journey. She occasionally spent months there. She even underwent electroshock treatment in 1952. Norman felt alone. He developed intimate, private relationships with the ladies he painted, which provided him with emotional support and enabled him to live. To put Mary nearer to the treatment facility, they relocated to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, in 1953. In an attempt to deal with the stress of everything, fame, pressure, and domestic sadness, Norm also started therapy. Norman Rockwell's autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator, was published in 1946. He described how, despite being viewed as a representation of American happiness, he frequently felt uneasy and frightened of failing. He wrote of his perfectionism, deadline pressure, and ongoing stress. However, he made no mention of anything particularly sinister. Many now think he took amphetamines to keep up with the fast-paced nature of his job. While silently suffering depression and anxiety behind the scenes, he painted cheerful faces, joyful families, and small-town life. That was omitted from the book. It wasn't the whole story, but it was safe. Rockwell then relocated his family to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, in 1951. Most people assumed it was only for the serene environment, but in reality, Mary, his second wife, was quite ill. She battled severe despair and drinking. The Austin Riggs Center, a renowned mental health facility in the community, was where she was receiving therapy. She even underwent electroshock treatment. Rockwell put in a lot of effort to pay for everything, including magazine covers and serial advertisements that helped pay for her medical expenses. His true home was a place of suffering and terror, but his artwork depicted a pristine America. Stockbridge appeared to be a fantasy. Since it was one of the few locations offering the type of mental health care Mary required, they were there. 1953 saw the emergence of a new type of turmoil from within his own family. Peter, his son, publicly stated that his father had been emotionally aloof and preoccupied with his job. It turned into a scandal. However, Rockwell's grandson later discovered letters that provided a different account. They demonstrated Norman's attempt to be there. He supported his sons, provided funds for their artistic endeavors, and even constructed a small studio for his eldest child, Jarvis. Norman's perfectionism did, however, occasionally take over. He had to borrow money from the bank to keep afloat as he repeatedly repainted a magazine cover that took him over a year to complete. His desire for perfection came at the expense of spending more time with his family. Mary unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack in 1959. Norman was devastated. The publications didn't want his artwork to reflect his unhappiness. The darker, more sentimental pieces were rejected. They desired happiness. He once heard his physician, Eric Erickson, say, "You paint your happiness, but you don't live it." That was painful. In order to continue working, he suppressed his emotions and kept it to himself, but this only made him feel more exhausted. Norman got married again in October of 1961. Molly Punderson, his third wife, was a retired educator. She was 65 and he was 67 years old. He was honest when he said that he married her because he needed help and she was organized. He was no longer able to manage the commercial aspect of his art. Molly restored order after years of battling Mary's illness and his own mental health. Everyone was taken aback by the marriage, yet it lasted until his passing. It might not have been a romantic tale. However, it provided him with stability when he most needed it. Then came 1963. Norman quit the Saturday Evening Post after 47 years. President John F. Kennedy was featured on his final cover following the assassination. He had painted 321 magazine covers overall. However, Norman believed that since the world had changed, he also needed to adapt. He had had enough of depicting contented white families. He was not allowed to depict black Americans in the magazine unless they were working as servants or in the background. "I portrayed the best of all possible worlds," he once remarked. Things like that are no longer relevant. At the age of 69, he was prepared to tell the truth. He started working at Look magazine in 1964. They allowed him to paint about issues that were important to him, such as injustice, civil rights, and actual suffering. However, the threats appeared as soon as he got going. Hateful letters were written. He was labeled a race traitor by some. Others claimed that if he continued to depict prejudice or paint black children, he would regret it. He continued despite some threats that were so grave that they endangered his life. He continued till he was 70 years old. He painted the issue that we all faced that same year. It featured U.S. Marshals strolling with Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old black girl, to school. Behind her, a tomato was splattered and curse words were written on the wall. It was startling. The readers were incensed. Subscriptions were canceled by thousands. The message was evident even if Rockwell employed a local girl as the model. Although that was the reality, this was not the America that the public desired. At last, Rockwell was expressing his true feelings through his paintings. He made an effort to atone for his earlier portrayal of black people in subservient roles throughout the 1960s. He was aware of his mistake. He spoke with activists, contacted civil rights organizations, and ensured that his new work was truthful and courteous. He was not interested in being viewed as a white savior. His goal was to portray black people as heroes in their own right. He paid attention. He evolved. Later in 1964, a horrible incident occurred. In Mississippi, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, 3 young civil rights activists, were killed. They were attempting to register voters who were black. It was organized by the local police and the Ku Klux Klan. They were discovered buried in a dam. Rockwell was unable to sleep. He experienced nightmares. He used it all to create the painting Murder in Mississippi. It captured their last moments. Surrounded by the shadows of the murderers and only illuminated by torches. For 5 weeks, he worked on nothing else. He had to complete the painting, even though it was unpleasant and unpolished. He painted nude children in the neighborhood in 1967. In a recently desegregated community, it depicted the first encounter between white and black children. It was silent, emotional, but not angry. He was 73 and exhausted. However, he is still struggling with his paintbrush. Something odd occurred in 1978. A Minnesota gallery had 7 of Rockwell's paintings stolen. It turned into the largest art theft in the state's history. The 1919 picture Taking a Break was among the pilfered items. 40 years later, in 2017, that one was found inside a house in New Jersey. Although someone had damaged it during a game of pool and it had been purchased for a few bucks decades prior, Rockwell had other mysteries. According to a 2013 book by biographer Deborah Solomon, he may have suppressed sexual urges, especially toward men, and concealed sensual paintings. She referenced notes and diary entries, one of which was about a young assistant he appeared to really like. Some analysts thought these clues were genuine. According to others, including Rockwell's own granddaughter, the accusations were unjust and incorrect. Although the reality is still unknown, it raised further concerns about his true identity behind the public persona. President Gerald Ford presented Rockwell with the Presidential Medal of Freedom on January 10, 1977. Even though it was the greatest honor a person could receive, Rockwell chose not to accept it. Jarvis, his son, took it on his behalf. By then, he was 83 and very ill. He confided in others that he occasionally thought he had sold out. He made a lot of money, but he sacrificed his more profound art to work in commerce. He questioned whether he had lost sight of his actual purpose. At the age of 84, he passed away on November 8, 1978. It was discovered after his passing that he owed over $50,000 in unpaid therapy costs. Today, that would be roughly $200,000. Throughout his life, he painted joyful sceneries for the world while attempting to manage his inner agony and anxiety. His paintings didn't tell a tale as the bills did. Then in 2004, in the house of another illustrator, Donald Trachta, something amazing was discovered behind a false wall. It was one of Rockwell's most well-known paintings, Breaking Home Ties. Most likely as a result of a sour divorce, the man had created a flawless replica to conceal the genuine one. The actual picture brought $15.4 million when it was put up for auction in 2006. Questions were raised by the discovery. How many more originals were there, kept in secret or concealed behind walls?